Dr. Mark Caleb Smith is Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities and Professor of Political Science at Cedarville University. Welcome back, Dr. Mark Caleb Smith.
It's always good to be with you. How are you doing today?
Doing pretty good. My silly first question is, who is this Gerrymander and why is everyone talking about him?
Yeah, Jerry's a popular guy, isn't he?
Yeah, he sure is. So I saw a TikTok post the other day, or the stream or whatever it's called. I'm getting old. I don't know what it's called. And it motivated us to call you because we need your help. So what it was, a lady frustrated standing in front of two different signs in Ohio. One of them said, "Stop gerrymandering in Ohio. Vote yes on issue 1." And the other one said, "Stop gerrymandering in Ohio. Vote no on issue 1." Right? So I'm like, we got to call Mark Caleb Smith. So we're going to do what we always do. Let's start with understanding terms and concepts. So first of all, what is gerrymandering?
Oh, goodness. So gerrymandering, so let's start at the very, very beginning in the sense that all the time, every 10 years when we have a census, government counts people to figure out how many people live throughout a state or throughout the country and where those people live. And based on those results, legislative boundaries are drawn, districts are redrawn. And so whether we're talking about the General Assembly in Ohio with our state senators or state House members, or whether we're talking about the U.S. House members, they represent geographical districts. Where those lines are is going to depend on what the population looks like in the state. And every 10 years, those lines are tweaked because of those changes. And so that's going to happen no matter what. Gerrymandering is drawing those lines in such a way to overtly benefit a political party that's in power. And so the goal isn't necessarily to represent the population well, but the goal is to maximize your party's power within the state as much as possible. And so districts are going to be drawn. Gerrymandering has often been the outcome of this drawing process, regardless of which party's in power. And that's kind of the issue that's driving this issue 1.
Now, when the Ohio State Constitution was written, why didn't they just, hire a geometry teacher to just make perfect zones and we just divide everything up in geometrically equal patterns?
I think, we could do that. But then if we did that, the population would not be evenly distributed across those zones. We could draw easy, simple shapes across the state of Ohio, but unfortunately, people don't live according to those shapes. And so whether we're talking about an urban area where there's a big concentration of people or a rural area where there's not very many people, you have to draw boundaries or districts that are relatively equal in population. So the Supreme Court has decided that this process demands equality across these districts in terms of the numbers of people represented. And so when you draw a district that includes Columbus, well, that's probably going to make up multiple districts in most situations. And then you look at a place like Cedarville, where I live, which is a village, we're not going to have our own representative. We're going to be lumped in with other groups of people. And it gets a little bit more complicated because of that. And so now there are ways you can make it a little bit more rational and geometric and traditional, if you want to use those terms, versus sometimes with these awful shapes that we end up with. But it isn't just a simplistic process.
Because correct me if I'm wrong, the goal is that there's an equal representation of the population in the state.
I mean, I think that's the theoretical goal in terms of having these districts be fairly represented across population. But then we start getting into issues of, well, how do we deal with an urban versus rural representation?
Yeah.
Is it fair for Cedarville to be lumped in with Dayton, for example? And so do we have the similar kinds of concerns when we vote for a representative as the population in Dayton would? Probably not. Should we be electing the same sort of person, or should we be lumped in with other rural voters who have similar kinds of concerns that we do so that we'd elect someone who'd represent us? And so you can understand how it gets to be pretty tricky at some level, even when we don't get into partisanship or things like race, that makes it even more complicated.
So without getting too deep into it yet then, for our clear understanding, who gets to decide how the boundaries for districts are redrawn when a new census comes out?
So this is a state-by-state process. And so as you know, our system is a federal system. A lot of things are devolved down to the state level. And this is one of those things that states are sort of tasked with doing. And in Ohio, we have a redistricting commission. We've amended our constitution relatively recently to deal with this problem, but it hasn't fixed it. But we have an Ohio redistricting commission that really is in charge of drawing the boundaries for General Assembly districts, and then the General Assembly can draw boundaries for the U.S. congressional districts. But if they fail to, this redistricting commission steps in as well. The problem, I think, is this redistricting commission has really struggled to get things done effectively, and they've run into lots of conflict with the Ohio Supreme Court, which has decided that the product of this redistricting commission has often been gerrymandered districts, which it's supposed to be avoiding. And so right now it's a commission that does it primarily. That commission is made up of the governor, the Secretary of State, the auditor, and then people from the General Assembly. And so we're talking about primarily elected officials who are engaged in this process. And shockingly, politics breaks out, right? So, we try to avoid it, but politics is always going to creep into it, especially when you're dealing with elected officials.
So, okay, this redistricting commission is comprised of politicians.
Right.
And how do they decide how many politicians from each side get on the commission?
So right now, obviously, it's the governor, Secretary of State, auditor. Those are sort of elected positions, and so those are whoever's in the office. Right now, 2 people from each party within the General Assembly are chosen, and those people will be from each party. And so it isn't overtly partisan in that sense. But if the governor, Secretary of State, auditor are of one party, then you end up with a majority of Republicans in this case on the commission.
So you could have a commission that's in charge of making it fair that is inherently stacked for one party.
Correct. Yeah, and that's whenever we're dealing with elected officials making these kinds of choices. In most states right now, including Ohio, there's a party that's clearly in power, and that's what you're going to end up with is a partisan group of people making a choice. And the temptation, obviously, is for them to draw lines that benefit themselves. And we can talk about this, but I think in Ohio, that's what we've seen.
Now, if we even sail all the way back in our minds to the founders, did they anticipate this type of problem when they comprised ideas with like the House of Representatives and determining those boundaries?
Yeah, they were familiar with some of these issues. This goes back to problems even in Parliament in Britain. They had what were called rotten boroughs in Britain, so they had their own sort of weird districts there. And I think they're trying to avoid that to some extent with the way that they structured the House of Representatives in particular. But I don't think they anticipated sort of partisanship creeping into the process quite so dramatically. And I think, I have a tremendous amount of admiration for our Constitution. I think it's the best Constitution that's ever been written. I study it, I teach it. But I think one of its weaknesses is that it did not really anticipate the kind of partisanship that would develop pretty quickly. And so, you opened up with talking about who this guy Gerry is. Well, that goes back to an actual figure. Elbridge Gerry was the guy who sort of started this process, and he was put, responsible for drawing this map, or was blamed for having a map that involved this sort of weird-looking district, and we ended up calling it a gerrymander, if we want to use his name properly. And so this has been around since we've been a country, but it's really a result of partisanship that they just didn't anticipate.
Do you think we could find any political scientists on any side of any political issue that would say, you know what, we're nailing it. The state of Ohio is doing great with drawing congressional district lines?
I think if you're talking about a political scientist who's interested in sort of looking at things from a detached perspective and trying to be fair and balanced, I don't think any of us would say this is a great process we have right now. If you're interested in promoting a partisan point of view, then maybe you'd say, oh, sure, I'm interested in seeing more Republicans in power, then this is a great process. But right now, it doesn't look like it really represents Ohio very well. And just, I don't know how deeply you want to get into this, but when you look at like the last several presidential elections, let's say Ohio's averaged a little over 50% support for the Republican Party. Right, that's kind of just where we've ended up. And now, recently, it's been a little higher than that, but let's say a little over 50%. But when you look at our U.S. House delegation, or when you look at the General Assembly breakdown, 75% Republican in the U.S. House, 65% Republican in the General Assembly in the House, 76% Republican in the Ohio Senate. And so that gap between what the statewide Republican, strength looks like versus its strength within those legislative bodies, that's really the issue that we're talking about.
Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but in theory, the system is supposed to work in that people in any sort of representative body, whether it's state or federal, it's supposed to be proportional to the population, as in we are to be represented in our perspectives proportionally the same in the state house, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be better on the whole. I think that would be better as if the General Assembly looked like Ohio as it relates to the partisanship of Ohio, or that the U.S. House delegation looked for the most part like Ohio when it comes to the partisanship of Ohio. And so,
but it doesn't do that now.
It is not, and I think not only do those outcomes look skewed, but we also have elections that are often just not competitive. And so it isn't even that the Republicans are winning a bunch of really close races. It's that the Republicans are winning stacked districts going away so that there is no competition within those districts themselves. And as a political scientist, that's really the most concerning part to me, because I think that twists a lot of the incentives in the system. I don't think the system's going to work the way that it's supposed to if most people are running what's essentially an unopposed race for a safe seat.
Dr. Mark Caleb Smith again from Cedarville University, where he's a political scientist. So, Doc, over the last number of years, Ohio voters have overwhelmingly voted to reform how we do this districting in the state. Can you tell us about those ballot issues?
Yeah, I mean, and the most recent one was the one I referred to earlier. The creation of this redistricting commission was a constitutional amendment that pulled power away from the General Assembly directly and created this other body made up of some General Assembly members as well as the governor, Secretary of State, and the auditor. And then this group can get together, draw maps, and if they can get a supermajority on that group, then it's a 10-year map. A supermajority would require votes from the minority members. We're talking about Democrats. It requires support from the Democrats as well. But then if they can't, then it becomes a 4-year map. And so far, this has just been a bit of a mess. Even Governor DeWine recently has said that, whatever the goal was of creating this redistricting commission, it hasn't worked the way that people thought it would. And the Ohio Supreme Court has had to step in on several occasions. I think it's 6 or 7 different times the Ohio Supreme Court has decided that the products of this commission just are simply it's just gerrymandering to the point where what the intent was in amending the Ohio Constitution is just not being lived out by this commission. And so it's been contentious. We haven't been able to draw 10-year maps as a result of this. And so we're just sort of in this cycle of having a map, having it tossed, having a map, having it tossed, running an election, hoping for the best. And it's been a bit of a mess.
And see, I was looking at a timeline of this, and it was actually pretty wild. I mean, so this commission you were telling us about would draw a map that their commission was designed to have it not unfair, to have it not be gerrymandered. Correct. And they would submit it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would say, no, you did it wrong.
That's right. They said, yep, this is gerrymandered.
How many times did that happen?
Do it again. I want to say it was 6 times total, but I kind of lost count. At some point, I was just like, this is just a mess. And so,
That's wild.
Back and forth. It went back and forth, and we've been running elections under contested maps, right? And so we've just been sort of hoping for the best at this point. And it hasn't been a disaster, but I mean, it hasn't been working the way that it was designed to work. And I think the issue 1 that's on the ballot is sort of hopeful that it gets at some of these things, but of course there are arguments back and forth on issue 1 as well.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like everyone's tried to fix this, and it's been a difficult thing to fix because it's complicated. So all that to say then, so the previous attempt, the Supreme Court of Ohio has said this is not working, essentially, because they keep sending the map back. So issue 1 is now on the ballot. What is issue 1 asking Ohio voters to do?
So if issue 1 is approved, it would create a commission of non-elected, non-political people, in theory, non-elected, non-political people who would then be tasked with overseeing the drawing of these maps. The way that it would work, and of course this would have to play out a little bit for us to see, but 4 retired judges in Ohio would be chosen to go through applications from people Up to 90 applications would be considered. That would be winnowed down to 45, and then from those 45, some Republicans, some Democrats, and some independents would be chosen, and then they would select the rest of the commission. We'd end up with 15 people on this commission with the goal of having 5 people associated with Republicans. Say someone who say, I have voted Republican. That's what we're talking about. Not an elected official, not a lobbyist, not a professional politician, but someone who's like attached to the Republican Party at some level, someone who's attached to the Democratic Party at some level, 5 of them, and then 5 people who are independent. And this commission of 15 people, not political people in theory, would then be tasked with drawing these maps. Now, obviously, they probably aren't going to have the technical expertise to draw maps. They're probably not going to be able to sit down and say, okay, let me pull out my protractor and have a go at this. But they could easily hire. This isn't, you and I talked before, we probably just can't have anyone draw these maps, but this isn't that complicated. With the software that we have now, with the census data that we have now, this is not that complicated to do, but it's a question of obviously the outcome would have to be considered. They have to look at the map and say, okay, this is one that we can live with based on what we know. And so they would be overseeing the drawing of the maps, and they could decide what looks like it's sufficient based on their goals. So if we choose, if issue 1 passes, this group of 15 people would be over the process compared to where we have now, who are elected officials ultimately making these choices.
Yeah, so now, if I'm understanding you correctly, we have politicians who are partisan who are asked to draw nonpartisan boundaries, and they've failed at it.
Right.
So somebody is saying, or this group that with issue 1 is saying, let's take it away from the politicians in some manner if it's possible,
right,
and see if we can then draw fair maps.
That's right. That's right. And hopefully by using the judges to select the people who then select other people, you remove it enough from the political process. Everyone's going to have political opinions, but you're trying to detach it from sort of the professional political class. Bring people in, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, 5 independents, and create this commission and let them oversee the process.
And now, as I was doing some research on this, I came to discover that's not even the end of the story. So tell me about the process of putting a ballot initiative on the ballot, because you can't put the whole thing. It's super long. You have to have a summary. Who gets to write the summary?
So the Secretary of State, I'm going to defer a little bit. I'm not an expert on how exactly that whole process works in the Secretary of State's office, but the Secretary of State oversees sort of arguments back and forth about what the language actually appears like on the ballot. They have descriptions that are sort of generic descriptions, and they have arguments pro and con that you can look up that have been written by various parties and then approved by the Secretary of State to be representative of the arguments. And so it's a lot of text. When you look at a ballot and when you go to the Secretary of State's website, there's a lot of information that you can see because this thing is a long ballot initiative. And like you said, there's no way they can put everything on there. And so they're trying to provide a fair summary as well as provide arguments on both sides. And I think the information that's there is relatively accurate, but there is a ton of information. And I'm a little worried people are going to walk into that voting booth or they've already looked at their early voting and they're just like, oh, my gosh, I don't know what to do with this. Even if I have an opinion, I'm just not sure what's going on here. And in those situations, people generally defer to just saying no. There's like, if I don't understand, it's just a no. And so it'll be interesting to me to see how this plays out.
Yeah, because, I mean, we should have talked about – I feel bad. We should have talked about this months ago because of early voting, but I guess it's the best we can do. But as I was thinking about this as well, it appears to me just on the surface that opponents of Issue 1 got to write the summary, and then the supporters of it got mad and sued them and said that's not a fair summary and took it to the Supreme Court. Am I getting this right?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. So there's been
what a mess
arguments on both sides of it. And I mean, at some level, that shouldn't surprise us, right? Because this is whether you're Republican, Democrat, and, we're in Ohio, so we're talking about Republicans. If we were in New York, we'd be talking about Democrats. If we're in California, we'd be talking about Democrats. And so gerrymandering isn't a Republican problem. It's not a Democratic problem. It's a party problem. But here we're talking about potentially draining some power away from the Republican Party in Ohio, which then makes this a very partisan issue. And so I'm not arguing one way or the other. It's just the reality is when these kinds of things happen, they get very contested because ultimately you're talking about potentially limiting the power of a party that has a lot of authority in the state of Ohio.
Now, I had somebody write to me a couple of days ago, faithful listener to the show. They said they'd done a bunch of research and they had a pastor share with them this quote, and I'd like your reaction to this. Issue 1 is an attempt by foreigners and out-of-staters to overthrow the will of Ohio citizens who voted by a 75% majority for a true anti-gerrymandering redistricting amendment in 2018.
Well, I mean, it certainly is funded to a degree by out-of-state interests at some level, for sure. But that's been the Ohio constitutional problem for a long time, as we've talked about before. Just like the issue 1 that dealt with pro-choice and with the abortion issue, also funded in that way. And so it's a fair argument in that sense. However, again, that's an argument based on the assumption that we really believe that one party should be in the position to make these choices, and that's the contested nature of this. I think I would argue when the previous constitutional amendment was passed, the goal then was to remove this from the partisan process as much as possible, and that has failed. And so now this is another attempt to remove it from the partisan process even more. If that's done by insiders, outsiders, that's, to some degree, I'm not sure that affects the substance of the issue itself. But that's just me, and I'm sure people would say, well, he's just being detached and he doesn't really care. Okay, that's fine. But I think, I'll just leave it at that.
And so, in theory, the way the system is designed in Ohio for funding on these ballot initiatives, out-of-state interests can fund both sides. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in Ohio, there's no mechanism in place to limit that sort of spending or to limit that kind of effort to collect signatures and put something on the ballot. And even as we've talked about before, for a simple majority to amend the Constitution in Ohio, then that's the process that's in place. I don't think it's a great process. I wish that it were a higher threshold of the population necessary to pass a constitutional amendment, but it's the system that exists right now. And they're taking advantage of that system just as people could take advantage of the system in other states that allow this sort of mechanism.
So now, are there other states that are wrestling with this, or is this just some weird Ohio problem?
No, this is a nationwide issue, I think, and other states are wrestling with it. And there have been some states like Iowa that have tried to sort of detach it more and more from the political process. And I think this is, a national issue because, again, I don't know if listeners quite understand when there are 435 elected members of the United States House. Of that 435, there are probably going to be 30 to 40 competitive elections.
Wow.
And that's shocking.
Yeah.
I don't care whether you're Republican, Democrat. It's shocking because so many people are running in largely not competitive races for some of the most important offices in our country. And the fact that those elections are not competitive is because of gerrymandering. And so if you're rolling out and getting 70 or 80% of the vote just for having your name on the ballot, and you're then going to Washington, D.C., you have no incentives to reach across the aisle. You have no incentive to solve problems necessarily. All you want to do is to keep those core supporters happy within your political party. And I get that, but that's not necessarily the right set of incentives for us to talk about solving problems and compromising and dealing with issues in a hard way. And I understand we all have different expectations out of our elected officials, but a lot of gerrymandering is distorting them so that by the time they get to Washington, D.C., they don't have any reason to do risky things or to take big swings or to try to solve hard problems. Their incentive is just, what can I do to keep those people happy? And I don't, otherwise I'll have an easy election coming in November. Worst thing I could do is to do something crazy and encourage a primary from someone to my left or to my right.
So in a sense, there's a need across the country for Americans to value a system that works over their own self-interest?
I mean, that's what I think, but I understand that's a hard sell in a lot of ways.
It shouldn't be, though.
This truly isn't a partisan issue. This is an issue where I think we want relatively equal representation, where people are running in competitive contests, where they're sensitive to voters, and where the people that we're sending to Washington, D.C. or to Columbus go through a reasonable set of elections and where they truly get a sense of what they're trying to accomplish when they get there. And right now, they're really just trying to accomplish the goal of satisfying their core partisan supporters, whether those are Democrats or Republicans.
Now, before we say goodbye, any final thoughts that we didn't get to in terms of issue 1 to help people make a decision?
I think I think there are a couple of arguments, yeah, for sure against it. Mostly, I guess you could argue. I've been saying things that are positive, but I think you could argue that there's no accountability. This 15 size commission could do things, and there's no way to reelect them or to throw them out of office. And so they could do things that could be objectionable. Now, there would be the judicial system to oversee it and to potentially toss maps out for a variety of reasons. But they aren't as accountable as elected officials are. And so I think that creates an issue. And then drawing maps is just really hard. It's complicated. There's going to be argument back and forth because of the nature of the population and distribution that we talked about before. And so no system is going to be perfect. And this one wouldn't be perfect either. And there could be areas of criticism for it.
Very good. Thank you for that. Again, Dr. Mark Caleb Smith is professor of political science and dean of the School of Arts and Humanities at Cedarville University. For more information about him and the school, I highly encourage you to go to cedarville.edu. Again, cedarville.edu. Dr. Smith, thanks for helping us understand such a complicated issue.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you and your listeners. You guys take care.
Hey there. Thanks for joining us. Like you, we're looking for a different kind of conversation. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video.